Welcome to this Q&A from the Fertility Alliance. Today we are joined by Natalie Gamble, who's a member of our advisory board at the Fertility Alliance and is a solicitor and the founder of NGA Law, which was the first fertility law firm in the UK. And Natalie's going to talk to us a bit about some of the legal questions that can come up when you're using donor eggs, sperm, or embryos. So welcome, Natalie. I wanted to start by asking you quite a basic question, which is what are the different options for people who are going to use a donor, the different kind of legal routes?
I guess overall there's about four different options. One option is to go to a UK fertility clinic and be matched with a donor that the clinic will have screened and kind of found for you. Another option is to do the same thing but at a clinic outside the UK, and that has quite different legal implications. The other route is to use a known donor, and there are essentially kind of two paths within that category as well. So you could work with somebody that you already know. Some people have family members or existing friends being a donor to them. Or you can go and look for a donor who will be a known donor to you via one of the online matching sites where you are actually finding someone who's volunteering to be a donor, but on the basis that you meet them and know them before you start the process.
So do you always need to get legal help if you're going to use a donor?
There's always a legal component to conceiving with a donor. And I think the key questions really are around who are going to be the legal parents of the child that's born, what goes on the birth certificate, what rights and responsibilities does everybody have in relation to the child. And then if it's a donor that isn't known to you, the other legal component is what rights to information are you going to have and your child is going to have, and when will you be able to access that? So there's definitely always legal information to know. But the kind of legal help that you need will depend on the way that you're conceiving, because clinics will provide a certain level of information. And if you're in a fairly simple situation, that may be sufficient. So you don't always need a lawyer. But if you're in a more complicated relationship status, if you're conceiving with a known donor, or if it isn't clear how the law applies to your particular situation, those are the situations where we as fertility lawyers tend to get involved in providing that information and guidance.
So do you automatically count as the legal parent of a child if you use donor egg, sperm, or embryo?
There's a very complicated answer to that question, but the short answer is that it completely depends on the circumstances. So the law in the UK has evolved over a period of time, and it caters for different types of parents in different relationship statuses differently. So ultimately, it depends on the kind of donor that you're using, whether you're in a relationship, whether you're married to your partner, and whether you conceive at a clinic or at home. But there are many situations in which parents are automatically recognised as legal parents, even if they're not biological parents. So, just very briefly at a high level, if you carry the pregnancy but you've had eggs from somebody else, then you will automatically be a legal parent. So, whoever gives birth to a child is recognised as the legal mother. The other parent, if they're not the biological parent, may or may not be a legal parent depending on the circumstances. But generally speaking, if they're married to the person who's giving birth, or if you conceive through a fertility clinic in the UK and sign the correct forms, then the other parent, whether that's a man or a woman, will be recognised as the other legal parent and can be recorded on the birth certificate.
So the agreements that people would sign going to a clinic, are they legally binding?
So they're not really agreements that are signed at clinics. So you sign consent forms at clinics, and some of that is consent to the treatment. But there's a particular set of forms that are called the legal parenthood forms that are the mechanism by which you say who you want to be the legal parents of a child. And in certain circumstances, particularly unmarried couples who are conceiving with donor sperm, that creates documents that will enable you to nominate the non-birth parent to be the legal parent. So in that sense, those documents are legally binding because they're creating parenthood. But the law in the UK is not the same as it is in other countries. So, for example, in America and in Canada, who the legal parents are is based on intention. And therefore, if you sign an agreement with somebody saying, I want to be a parent, or I don't want to be a parent, I just want to be a donor, that agreement will be recognised. In the UK, we don't have that law. So it's all about who's giving birth, who's married to who, what forms have been signed at the clinic. So it's a bit more complicated than just saying that agreements are binding. It's more about the circumstances more broadly, but then what consent forms have been signed if you are conceiving at a clinic.
So if people, we know that quite a lot of people opt to have treatment overseas now for donor treatment. are the agreements, are the papers that they sign, the consent forms that they sign abroad the same? And are the rules the same if you have treatment in a clinic overseas?
No, the rules are slightly different if you conceive overseas. So if you're British and you're just going, you live in the UK, you're just going to another country to have the treatment, then it's UK law that's going to apply in terms of who the legal parents of your child are. And essentially, if you are conceiving with donor eggs but carrying the pregnancy, then you are the legal parent. Doesn't matter where in the world you conceive. Also, if you're married and you're conceiving with donor sperm, then you will be the legal parent, whether that's a same-sex female parent or the legal father if you are a man. You have to be married before the time of conception. But in any other circumstances, you can't sign agreements or clinic forms to make you a legal parent. So sometimes we're working with parents who are planning to go abroad and kind of talking to them about the twin options of either get married before you have your embryo transfer, because that will mean that you are automatically a legal parent, or if you don't want to get married or it's not possible to do that, there is a process you can follow to do a step parent adoption application after the birth to become a legal parent. But going overseas does mean that you don't have access to that route of signing clinic forms to become a legal parent in the way that you can if you're conceiving at a clinic in the UK as an unmarried couple.
And can children born from donated egg, sperms, and embryo always trace the donor eventually? How does that work?
So again, it's a really interesting question, and one that seems to be kind of changing really fast because of technologies and how things are kind of evolving in the wider world. So in the UK, we have a legal framework which is designed to guarantee donor conceived children access to information, assuming, of course, that they know that they're donor conceived and know to access that information. So there is a structure for being able to access non-identifying information about your donor before you reach the age of 18, and then identifying information afterwards. There's also a structure for asking for information about any donor conceived siblings in other families to whom you're genetically related, as long as they're happy for that information to be shared as well. Most other countries don't have that same structure. So whether you would be able to contact a donor in the future if you've conceived at an overseas clinic, or if you've conceived outside a clinic in the UK, will depend on what other ways of making contact. So you can set that up yourself. So for example, in some overseas clinics and agencies, they will agree to kind of hold that information for the future. There are some voluntary registries overseas as well, where people can connect and kind of register their details to make contact. But what's happening these days is a lot of people are making connections via DNA testing websites. So these kind of Ancestry.me type things where you can kind of find genetic relatives. So there are different ways of accessing information about donors. So I think, from a donor's perspective, you can never really donate now on the basis it would always be anonymous. That's just something that doesn't really exist anymore. But how you conceive your child is going to affect how they are then able to access information in the future and how straightforward that is.
There are often quite alarming stories about donors producing huge numbers of children around the world. I mean, are there actually legal limits on the number of times that someone can donate?
So in the UK, and in the context of donations that are happening at licensed clinics, each donor is allowed to create no more than 10 different families. So each of those families can have multiple siblings, but you can't have any more than 10 families. The difficulty is that regulation only applies to licensed clinics. So a donor at a licensed clinic in the UK might donate outside the UK, or they might donate informally in the UK and not conceive through a clinic. So those limits only have a kind of limited application, really. And there are, as you say, there are some kind of horror stories, particularly from overseas, about donors who've conceived hundreds and hundreds of children, and obviously that may have significant implications for those children. So, in some ways it's an advantage of conceiving through a clinic in the UK that there is more control of it, but that's not always the whole story either.
Obviously, if you're using an egg donor, you have to go through a clinic, but with sperm donation, which can be quite costly, there's often a temptation to look online where there are more and more kind of websites and things that you can link with a donor. I mean, are there concerns about people doing that? Are there things they should know before they do it?
Yeah, I think it's one of those things that it's always important to proceed really carefully. I mean, there are potentially safety risks in terms of screening and so on, but also there are legal implications as well. And some people will do a kind of middle option where they'll meet somebody on an online forum because they want to know who their donor is, but then go and conceive at a clinic so they have access to the screening. So it's not necessarily a kind of either or route. And there are very good reasons why people do want to know their donor. I think particularly in an age where donor conceived children are ultimately going to be able to find out information about their donor, some parents feel that it's better for them to choose and to know the donor from the start and to have that transparency all the way through. I think the biggest challenge if you enter into an arrangement like that is that your family unit is less kind of protected and autonomous for that time while your child is young because the donor is there in that arrangement and you're going to need to manage that relationship. And we do see, really successful known donation arrangements, but I think the key is the relationship between the adults staying harmonious. And when the relationships break down and there's kind of conflict between the adults, that can be incredibly difficult for everyone that's involved. So I think it's something to go into with your eyes wide open, that in some ways it's a more complicated scenario. It might seem simpler at the time you're doing it, but in the long run, that's an extra person that you're involving in your parenting in your child's life, whether their involvement is small or big, but you are going to have to work together to some extent and maintain that relationship.
Following on from that, can donors ever claim custody of a child? Does that ever happen?
So I've never seen any cases where a donor has been able to have custody, as in the child live with them. But there have been quite a few cases where donors, particularly sperm donors, have applied for rights of contact where the relationship with the legal parents has broken down. And these are applications that are decided in the family court, which has a really broad discretion to do what it thinks is in the child's best interests. And every case is completely fact specific. So, we've had some donors who've been given very little contact, maybe a letter once a year. We've had other donors who've been essentially given a separated father role of very regular contact, maybe every other week. And it really does depend on what's happened to date, what relationship the child has already developed with the donor, whether they've been very involved and then suddenly that's been taken away, or whether they've never had that involvement. And also the kind of attitude of the parents and the donor to each other and the difficulties in that relationship. So there's never a kind of guarantee if you go into a known donation arrangement that the donor would never be able to make applications or would never be able to have contact with your child that you don't want. But they don't automatically have those rights either. They do have to apply for them.
So you've been involved in quite a few cases where things have gone wrong in donation agreements. And I wondered if there were any common themes that come up that it would be useful for people to be aware of.
I think the biggest common theme in all these cases is mismatched expectations. I think in almost all the donor disputes that we have seen, they have grown from seeds that were there right at the start. So I think that scenario where the parents want the donor to have quite a limited role, the donor wants more of a role than he has communicated clearly, and that mismatch is there from the very beginning, that can very quickly escalate into a conflict after the child is born. But obviously there are also scenarios where what people expect at the beginning isn't how things actually turn out, and the donor wants more involvement than he thought he would. So I think it can be really helpful to protect against difficulties, to kind of go slowly, talk things through slowly, not rush into things, go through a process of putting a written agreement in place, because it helps you to really kind of get into the detail of what your expectations are. And the act of kind of putting things in writing and finding the words for that can be really helpful in setting strong foundations, even down to things like, what are you going to be called? Are you going to be Dad? Are you going to be John? Are you going to be something in the middle? Those things can be quite indicative of kind of how you feel about your status and your role, and agreeing those things at the start can be kind of create that solidity that everybody can kind of grow from. So I think, rushing into things, not having aligned expectations, those are the most kind of common problems that we see.
Are there templates that people can use of kind of the key questions that they ought to be asking before they enter into agreement, or would they really need to come to see a lawyer for that?
Yeah, I mean, to some extent there are. We actually provide a template agreement to help people who, don't want or can't afford to have legal advice, but do want to kind of put an agreement in place. And that's designed with some key questions, with some spaces where people can kind of add in their own words, but it is designed to kind of give them that steer. But also, I think it can be really helpful to get advice, because if you have a third party, whether that's a lawyer, potentially it could be a counselor as well, but somebody to kind of challenge what you're saying, what do you mean by the words you're using, and kind of helping you to unpick it, that can be really helpful as well.
Natalie, thanks so much for that whistle-stop tour around the legal aspects of donation that people might want to consider. That was very helpful. You can find this and many other Q&As from the Fertility Alliance on our YouTube channel.